What's the best first line from a proposal you ever read, or the most memorable line where you said, I know that this is a book I want to sign? Somebody want to start?
I can't say that I knew it was a book I wanted to sign, but I got it over the transom query. I shouldn't even say this publicly for fear that I'll get more over the transom queries, but I got an over the transom query years ago. The first line of which was, Dear Mr. Simonoff, it would be an egregious lapse of judgment for you to represent me. Allow me to outline 10 reasons why.
And what book was that?
It was a book called The Gargoyle by a writer named Andrew Davidson, the first novel. And it was a fantastic first novel. But that line, this is not to encourage people to send over the transom submissions, but it was a grabber.
It's interesting. For me, it's different because I don't usually look at the query letters. I just read the manuscript because that's what tells me if I'm going to be able to sell it or not, if I'm going to love it. And so I don't really care that much about the query letters. The one thing I do tell people is try to convey the tone of your novel in your query letter, if anything else. But for me, it's all about the novel. It's the manuscript, and that's what gets me.
I think there's a surprisingly high correlation between what they say in that query letter and whether or not the manuscript is going to be any good. And the best first line that I ever had was, Anthony Bourdain says that we should work together. And it turned out that it was Gabrielle Hamilton, and he was right. So that sort of thing, it does go a long way when you're getting a recommendation from somebody who you trust pretty completely, not to be wasting your time or wasting anybody else's time. It's probably the best first line.
But she said that and he hadn't been in touch with you?
I don't remember, honestly, if he'd given me a heads up or not, but that came through and I didn't read the rest of it. I just picked up the phone and called him.
Because we do get queries from people who say, so-and-so recommended
No,
this.
shocking.
And then you call them and they say, I have no idea.
Right. And that happens more often than not.
The imposters.
Well, the best first line I can recall was written by an author named Sterling Seagrave, and his father was a best-selling author in the 1940s. He was called the Burma Surgeon, and Seagrave grew up in Southeast Asia, so he wrote a book proposal where the first line said, China had 3 daughters. One loved money, one loved power, and one loved China, and they were Sun Yat-sen's daughters. I love that opening.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yep, and you signed him.
And I signed him, and we sold. Actually went on to become a New York Times bestseller because the Taiwanese government, it was critical of Chiang Kai-shek, took out ads in the New York Times. Professors from universities in Taiwan telling everybody how terrible the book was, and went right on the New York Times bestseller list.
Nice.
Right.
Can't ask for better press.
Right.
I remember just the bad ones. It's so funny. I don't remember
that could be funny
ones.
too.
Yeah.
I remember, the really bad ones are ones that are on really weird subjects. Like one person who sent me a query for a memoir and a cookbook, and they were hair pullers. I mean, that's the whole thing was about pulling hair. And
In a cookbook?
yeah, and and a lot.
How does that affect the recipe?
If it's all those that those are the ones that sort of stand out for me. Ones that, there's one that is so vulgar I'm not even sure I can bring myself to say it right now. They came in this week and I was like, that would actually be the perfect one, except every single word in it is an expletive, and it's someone who had a best-selling novel before who sent it. It was called, if you can believe it, it was called F*** That and he actually wrote a novel that sold, and the reason that is what I read.
Hey, Walmart's not going to start.
Right.
I know,
That's
it was
big trouble right there.
book then.
Right.
And he said he just wanted to get to agents that would get past that subject
Interesting.
line. And the description of the book was actually really interesting. And his first novel that he published sold a couple hundred thousand copies. But he sent it through, and my assistant forwarded it to me and said, "This guy says he knows you." And I looked to see what it was, and I was like, actually, I do know this guy, because he was represented by a former colleague, so who left the business. So, but unfortunately, those are the ones that sort of stand out most for me.
Mine is in the form of the opening line of a complaint letter to American Airlines. It's in a novel by Johnny Miles, and it opens, "Dear American Airlines, my name is Benjamin R. Ford, and I am writing to request a refund of $392 some odd dollars." And it then goes on to be this blistering complaint about the modern condition. And when I first read the opening pages, I didn't think he could sustain this for a full novel. And it is completely brilliant, but it absolutely captures your attention from the opening passage.
One thing we want to talk about today, which is I think our audience is very interested in, is the state of the film and television adaptation world. What's the biggest frustration that you guys have with the way that Hollywood handles books?
How much time do we have?
We got an hour.
Where do we start?
For me, there's a problem that's very contemporary, which is the studios, at least to the book agent, feel very driven by tentpole materials and franchises, and it makes it extraordinarily difficult to take a book that is distinctive and literary and get it the kind of attention it deserves in the town. The other problem is feeling stuck in development forever and ever and ever. And we're all going to have some kind of story about a major novel that has been in development for 5-6 years, maybe purchased outright and still not going anywhere. And the idea that something can sort of remain stuck with no sense of momentum whatsoever and very little chance of getting it back is obviously the biggest frustration of all.
You guys agree? Other thoughts?
I think also, obviously, some of the adaptation. I mean, obviously, you have to alter it, a bit because it's a different medium. But, when they buy it because they love the book and the fan base loves the book, and then they all come aboard and they want changes that have nothing to do with the book, the tone of the book, the message of the book. And to me, that's the most frustrating part, because then you think, well, why did you buy it? Why did you option the book? You could have just written that script yourself. So, and that's also, for me, the scariest part, because you need to trust that they are going to be true to the book, because otherwise, why option it?
Well, now you have, with Stephenie Meyer, have had 2 big experiences now. And, the interesting thing about her is that she does get a lot of control. At least on the Twilight stuff, she had a ton of control over casting. There are some authors, Stephen King famously doesn't care. What do you guys feel is the state of authors' power to have more control over the work that gets adapted?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, because studios don't want authors stopping the picture, and some powerful authors will insist on having script approval and other approvals. And the other issue is that it's a different medium. And if you take a look at the book The Godfather, and you read that book, and then you compare it to the film, they're 2 completely different animals. You have a handful of scenes being taken out of a book. Probably 75 or 80% of the book is gone. And that's what Coppola used to make a movie. So when an author looks at that, and then looks at this, the book, the screenplay, as Tom Clancy once said to Brandon Tartikoff, there's one scene in your film from my book, which was the Patriots. But nonetheless, the film went on to make hundreds of millions of dollars around the world at the box office. So it is a different medium. It's like a sculptor and a painter. Even though they're both artists, they're in different mediums.
But for authors who care about it.
Well, the one thing I also wonder, though, if there's a difference between young adult and adult in the way they are adapted, because young adults have this rabid teen base, this rabid fan base, I should say. And so the smart studios, I think, are the ones that know you have to be true to those fans. You have to really, listen to them, because they're the ones you want to get in that theater, too, and who are going to spread, the good word about the film.
Do you
with
think
the blogs
that's just
and
because
whatnot.
they're younger, so they have more naive kind of expectations?
You know what? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say younger. I really just meant to say they're a bit more rabid, is what it is. It's
They're
not
activist,
youth,
yeah.
because you get old. I mean, there are older fans too for those younger books, but there's just something about that kind of fan base where they're all online. They're all talking things up, and like I said, and if they don't think it's been true to the book, and if they think they've heard like some bad word, they will put the word out not to go see it. And that has a big impact. So I think.
Have you guys walked away from film deals where the studio was saying we're not giving the author control over casting?
Casting? No.
Casting?
No. Casting,
Script?
yeah. You don't normally have that kind of control. I mean,
But I've seen one of the Twilight deals. Stephenie Meyer had casting.
We had a lot of
consulting.
There's a
control.
wide
Yes.
range of author involvement, and I think most authors are thrilled that a studio is going to make a movie adapted from the book. Even, I hate to say it, a bad movie sells tie-in editions. A bad movie can still really move books, which is what the authors are counting on. And then there's some authors, like our client, Stephen Chbosky, who wrote one book, Perks of Being a Wallflower, and knew at the time that he really didn't want anybody to adapt it or direct it other than himself. And when you take that position, it slows the process down enormously. I mean, the book came out in the late 90s, the movie came out in 2012, but he got it exactly the way he wanted it to be by maintaining complete
What
and
was
total
his
control.
experience though before that? I mean, had he written other
He'd been,
screenplays, or was
he'd
that?
been in television. He'd
So,
had a very successful
so there's a
television
reason
career.
for it. Yeah.
But like someone like Bill O'Reilly, does Bill O'Reilly care about the adaptations of his
Sure,
book?
yeah.
Does he care what the critics say? Does he care? Does he have input? Does he require input?
He is certainly very involved in the process. It reflects on his brand to put out.
Right.
When
Yeah,
Nat
he
Geo
has to
stuff
be
we put out,
protective.
Killing Lincoln, it has to be good.
But I also think
But
there's a
there
difference.
has to be a difference between, there is a difference between consulting on a film and having approvals on a film. Most authors do consult. Most authors talk to the producers, they'll talk to screenwriters, in some cases they'll talk to the actors. But there's a huge gap between having an approval, an absolute approval, and being
Right.
a consultant on a picture.
I also think that's different when it's a franchise versus a one-off or a brand, because you have to be more protective of a franchise and a brand. A one-off, like you say, I mean, you're going to sell books no matter what, which is fantastic, and you don't have as much to lose if it's a one-off. You don't have to worry about a sequel
I
book.
still remember when they cast Tom Cruise in Interview with a Vampire, and Anne Rice
I
went
remember Anne
bananas,
Rice, yeah, everyone
took out
remembers
ads.
that, yeah.
protesting, and then ended up seeing it, ended up loving
Loving
Tom
it,
Cruise
right,
and
yep.
retracting all of her protests.
It's probably the healthiest path for an author not to want to control how their movie comes out. Because I can remember Pat Conroy calling Rebecca Wells when she got the film deal for Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood and saying that trying to supervise the making of, I think it was Prince of Tides, I can't remember, one of the older books, pretty much cost him his health. And that his advice to her was to stay as far away from the process as possible. So I think that it depends on who your client is, what skill set they have, but to the degree that I can talk them into consultation versus trying to develop a whole new career. The other thing is that writers lose a huge amount of time at their desks if they become very, very involved in making the film. So it has to be a conscious choice that that's what they want to do with the next couple of years, rather than saying, I trust you that we sold it to the right people with the right director and that that this is going to come to either nothing or something reasonably positive, and I'd rather use my time to create my next book. Yeah. I think that's probably the happier path.
I work with a lot of journalists who, when, because they're usually the kinds of books that are not studio plays, they're things that get developed outside of the system and might eventually get picked up by a Warner Brothers or sort of part of some financing package. And I found that it usually starts as some sort of collaboration. I mean, clearly everyone has their role, the writer has their role, but I'm thinking about, movies like The Right or even Argo. I mean, Tony Mendez was very, very involved with Chris Terrio. I mean, more than even the producers knew to some extent, because Chris was consulting with him and it was so much wrapped up in his experience. And with journalists, especially when you have areas of expertise, they really want to engage. I mean, so it's not really so much about contractual negotiation over controls or approvals, but it's really about helping make a better movie and availing yourself of the process, and feeling that someone's not just taking your work and running with it, but that you really are able to have a voice in how it works. And we work, we've been very lucky because we've worked, very closely with the producers and the writers to help nurture the process along, and it helps it stay more immediate and more active in a lot of ways too, because it's not just sitting on someone's desk waiting for the producer or the studio to read it, but because we don't have the kinds of books I represent are generally literary fiction or they're narrative nonfiction. We it's a collaborative process by and large, and we don't you don't find those kinds of studio conversations over approval because there's no studio.
Right. But I do find it more successful. The more they involve the authors, the more successful the project tends to be, contractually or not. Because
from a PR perspective as well. Last thing you want
yeah.
is the Anne Rice situation where the author's out there trashing the movie before it even comes out. I mean, Stephenie Meyer's support of Twilight with her fans was key to launching the franchise.
Well, you also oftentimes get two different approaches. There's a studio approach, and then there is the producer's approach. And oftentimes if you put the writer with a producer and the producer has a good take on the book and the writer likes it, the process becomes a lot easier until it gets to the studio where they start changing it all around. But there are two different solar systems, and which is the studio system and the working with a producer.
Is there a strategy for timing this? Do you want to try and sell rights before publication? Do you want to wait till after publication? Is there a way of planning this out that makes sense for different kinds of books?
It feels like it used to be more rigid, right? It used to be that material had to get out as soon as possible to the time that you were submitting it to publishers, or there was no chance that that book was going to get made. And now it seems like there's a bit of a longer window.
It's also totally dependent on the kind of material and where the author is in his or her career. So I have a debut spy novel that's publishing this spring, and we've had a couple of offers for it, and neither one of them have been just the right thing. And I have a guy who spent 33 years of his career taking risks. So he's been happy to say no to offers. A lot of authors aren't willing to take that risk. So you have to take each of these individually. You have to take your author's sort of tolerance for risk and also what they need out of their career into consideration when you make those decisions.
There are 5 distribution companies in Hollywood. And if one of those companies is not in the deal somewhere, you have a very serious problem. When you submit material to studios and it's covered, or studios have scouts in New York who cover material, and generally the people who cover this material can be college students, can be assistants in offices, some people who do it just professionally as for coverage. But once that negative coverage is inside the studio, there's virtually nothing any producer can do coming in with a book and saying, well, I really love this book, I really want to do this book, because Hollywood is filled with people who have the power to say no. And there are a handful of people who have the power to say yes. And the risk factor for saying yes on something that already has negative coverage on is a major issue. That goes back to what you were saying about the timing of submitting books to Hollywood. And I would say that one of the major issues in the timing discussion is doing it in a way before the studios could get a hold of the property.
Of a negative piece of coverage.
Well, I mean, the way around
Also,
that-
part of it is with the scouts too. I mean, they're getting it out.
They're
and
scouting
they're
it for
submitting
foreigners, for foreign
But also
anyway.
And it gets to film, and you have to watch out for that.
If you
yeah.
can surround
Yeah.
a piece of material, even a piece of material that got negative coverage, with an A-list director, with an A-list
Well, that's my
producer, with
question.
an
There are ways
A-list
to
star.
work
Who
with
is
it,
the
yeah.
top producer for books, in your opinion? Everyone used to say Rudin, but we've also heard that Rudin buys so much that it goes into some hole and will never get made. So who is the top producer?
I would still have to say, from our perspective, Rudin remains the king.
For a certain kind of books.
Right.
Yeah, for certain kind of books.
Certain
Yeah.
kind of play, certain kind of book.
I don't have one person really. And that's why I always get my authors on the phone with the producer and the studio exec, because you can always tell, when they're sincere or not, and when they're describing the book and what they got from the book, and if they got it or not, because that's really all you can rely on, is if they do want to be true to the book. And because once it's, no matter how much control you have, there are so many people involved in this process that you just have to know that the main people really love what they originally bought and want to protect it. And that's all you can do.
all you
And so
can hope
for
for.
me, that's really all you can hope for. And so that's why, and there's no one person. It's really whoever sees, what I don't work with the same producer over and over again. So it's really who's ever right for that book.
Is TV more attractive now than it was a few years ago, say, with HBO and Showtime investing a lot of money, and Netflix and original programming? Is the small screen more attractive to authors than it was before, who maybe wanted just a movie made out of their book?
You have to talk through the economics of TV because
Yeah.
it works very differently. For authors who are used to getting, big option fees up front, I mean, TV doesn't pay anything close to that. But, TV is like holding a lottery ticket, so if it works, it really works. But we found that there's a much more active marketplace for books and source material in television now than there is really
Ever
in
has been.
features. And, the last 2 or 3 years in particular, we've had, like several pilots, for projects that the author was, had varying degrees of involvement. So it's been very active and fun. It's a whole new group of people that you're interacting with, and they're very, they're really excited about source material and new ideas coming into the system because, it's such a writer-driven
Right.
system in TV that, to have new ideas and new voices sort of emerging, I think, outside of, especially for me, it's been largely in the comedy space. They're excited for new people to emerge.
What's
So
the
it's also
impact that
fast.
you've seen on sales of books?
it's fast.
But
I mean,
that's
it's
it's fast. We have a movie coming out that Robert Redford adapted. It's 10 years in the making. It's Neil Gordon, both the company you keep, but then you have pilot season. It either
Yeah.
happens or it doesn't happen.
Right.
And
But
But you
it's
have,
amazing.
you have a big shift. You have a big shift taking place in Hollywood, an economic shift, and it's a major shift. When I was on the board of directors of William Morris, no one wanted to talk about being in the TV business. Everyone wanted to be in the film business. But today, because of the economic shift taking place, where at the top of the pyramid, Hollywood is paying big money, and everything underneath that has been reduced very substantially, the big agencies are shifting back into the TV business, but not the network business as much as it is in the cable area in terms of books. Brian Pike at CEA, who I had breakfast with last week, said to me that he's never seen this amount of interest in books and cable in his entire career, at CEA, and he's going down a list of books, of nonfiction books that you would think that that Hollywood would normally be interested in.
that
Suddenly,
brings up
the History Channel is the place.
Right, that brings up a wider issue, in both in film and TV. Books are being optioned and made in some cases that don't even have narrative structures. I mean, you look at the What to Expect When You're Expecting. I mean, Warner Brothers optioned the Emily Post, Manners book. Like, do you guys feel like there is because the movie and to a certain extent the TV business is becoming more brand driven, that books with concept and title are riper than they've ever been for adaptation, even if they don't have narratives or characters even?
Obviously, right? You've said it. It's happening.
But is it trickling down to bigger advances? Is it trickling down to more opportunities?
No, I mean, I actually think there's less, probably because publishers got burned so many times over the last however many years. I don't think they care that much anymore that we've got an option or we've got something set up in Hollywood anymore. The reason to do it in that direction has gotten weaker, not stronger, over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And in TV, there's not a lot of money for the source material, which is the book to begin with. So I like to tell my clients, think of it as a big TV commercial for your publishing.
Mm-hmm. So are publishers less interested in where the status of the film rights are, or in having a piece of the film rights? We see, there's when a film is made, the rewards can be great, and some publishers seem to want to have a bigger say potentially in that. Is that true?
I think publishers want to see the properties that they have out there made into film, no doubt about it, whether it's feature film or television. There's no doubt, because it is a big ad, no matter which screen we're talking about. I haven't had anybody, I'm just trying to think if there's an exception. I haven't had anyone try to participate in the exploitation of film rights on any of my projects in a very, very long time.
They try to come around the back way once the deal is done, but
Yeah.
with Random House Films and some of the others, but
Right.
but not as part of the deal structure. No.
How about two of the biggest trends, it seems like, in the last couple of years have been YA. It's hard to call YA a trend, but it's been particularly hot, and 50 Shades has certainly had an impact. Have either one of those peaked yet, or do we still see?
I think YA, the publishers are constantly chasing yesterday's trend and trying to predict what the next one will be. So they tend to overbuy in certain areas depending on what's working. So Twilight obviously sparked a huge buying craze in a sort of paranormal romance area.
But I think also the publishers, in some ways, they feel like studios. For instance, Dystopia, which was the current, and it followed, and I think now it's come to an end. And I felt like publishers got satiated. And it's sort of the same thing with studios, where they each had their dystopia, so they didn't need another one. And I felt that publishers, if they had their big dystopian series, they didn't need another one, because how many can you really promote? So I think that definitely they get satiated just like studios. But in terms of YA as a whole, I think it just comes down to great writing, and there's never going to be an end to that.
I really hope there's never an end to YA, because that also means
won't
that
be.
young people are reading.
Well, it's not just young, but it's not just young people. Right. It's the 20s and 30s something also reading it. So
they're young.
That won't end.
Those people are young.
But
And,
teens,
and
but
also,
it won't
and also
end,
the
but,
key is really coming in the early part of the trend as opposed to coming in at the tail end. We have a book called Wonder, which is a wonderful book. It's a middle grade book. It's about bullying. It's a novel. And the agent had a hard time selling it initially because publishers didn't think the middle grade students would read this subject. And now, of course, because of the book's success, publishers are buying books in that category.
But you always get that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's
following,
always
yeah.
the case with something truly original that you'll start the trend, but it'll be difficult to do so, and then everyone else rushes in with something that's derivative.
Absolutely,
Some
absolutely.
of the hardest books to sell for me have been the ones that ended up selling the best. I mean,
Yeah.
the Nanny Diaries, I couldn't give it away. I mean, we got one offer, and and it was they almost walked away over the payout, on a tiny deal. And I can think of 3 or 4 other examples like that where there was just something really fresh and different, but that different makes it scary, and they're just not willing to risk it.
I have to say that for me, I haven't had that case in YA. I think they're more willing to. Again, it goes from the writing, and there's something fresh and original that they know they can sell, that they know will connect to the readers. And like Twilight certainly was not hard to sell. And I think Matched also, which was, I think the one that really captured the dystopian world there, also was in, because it was so different and the writing was so original. And I think.
Do you guys have a one that got away? Something that you read and passed on that you saw? Like, did you guys read
One.
any of you?
I was going to say, you haven't been in the business if you don't have a hand.
But give us, how many of you read The Help and passed?
None.
Something like that.
Actually, you took on a book that I saw that I passed on, Lionel Shriver.
Oh.
And that book haunted me everywhere I went. I didn't get on a plane. I didn't go on vacation. I went to London. Everywhere I went, someone was sitting right next to me reading that book. And I loved it.
arranged that, by the way.
Just taunting you. They're just taunting you
Honestly,
forever.
I was too scared because
You're
of her
talking about we
track.
need to talk about Kevin, right?
Yeah, and I was
Right.
too scared by her track at that point because it was
Very
challenging.
interesting. I read that book. I was 39 weeks pregnant. It's a book about a woman who gives birth to a boy who ultimately becomes incredibly violent. And I found it like the most relaxing thing I could possibly read. I didn't know anything about Lionel Shriver, including the fact that she was a woman, because I was home and I was purposely not plugged in. Like I didn't go running to the computer. Thank God there was somebody in my office who took a look at that manuscript who also didn't know who Lionel Shriver was, but who was absolutely captivated by it. And their only hesitation was, is this a book you really send to your boss when she finally has said she's not working for a week before her first child is delivered? And I loved it. And when I called, Lionel does have a very kind of fierce, strong voice. And when I called her to say, hey, I can't stop thinking about this book. I can't stop, let's work together. It took me like 2 seconds, and then I realized I'm not talking to a man. Like, it was very interesting, yeah. So that's the.
It's an extraordinary book.
It just.
I think I had.
You were looking at all the facts.
Yeah, and I didn't have kids. I was just sort of in the whole thing seemed sort of, but I had the wrong facts.
It was the best book to read. I always give it to women who are pregnant because no matter what you do, no matter what you're feeling, it could never turn out this badly.
That's well put.
Does anybody else have one that got away they want to, that stands
I have
out?
so many more than one that got away that I can't even isolate one. Although I do tell the younger agents at WME that the list of authors I represent is matched in prestige and sales by the list of authors I passed on.
The memoir space. Let's talk a little bit about that because that's an intersection between Hollywood, and publishing. Is there someone who right now is considered the big get? Someone who has not written a memoir that should and would sell very well, but has not decided to?
Mick Jagger. That's a huge book.
Yeah, I'll never get it, I don't think, but I really want to do Bill Murray's memoir.
That's a great idea.
That's a great idea.
Both
Yeah,
Jimmy
we made
Page
it.
and Robert Plant.
Yeah.
And they haven't done anything?
No, Jimmy Page did a big, high-end visual book, but neither of them have written memoirs.
Interesting.
Do rock stars make great writers then? Because it seems like every rock memoir sells well, and you guys have all named musicians. Are musicians, is that a good crossover? Do they write better memoirs than actors in some ways?
Great collaborations make for great rock memoirs.
Yeah.
And you look at the Keith Richards and how much that book reads like his voice, and the amazing recall for detail out of a guy who spent his whole life having a good time. That's a great collaboration.
There's also a lot more attention on the proposals and advances. I know that you had Lena Dunham's book, which was a huge sale. But they got a lot of attention, like that whole battle with Gawker over publishing the
Well,
proposal.
Gawker has it out for Lena anyway. I mean, long before I met Lena Dunham, I think Gawker, she's so many people like to send up. I was surprised by, first of all, how much coverage there was over the advance, but also I was definitely surprised by the decision to publish that proposal.
But has that been resolved?
Resolved.
Meaning, because I thought lawyers were involved. Did they take it
Gawker
down?
took
or?
it down, yeah.
They took it down?
Back in the day, they took it down.
Okay.
So, and that was the resolution. I mean, after that, there's
And the business of certain types of memoirs, like, for instance, musicians or actors, depends on what the comps are, on what's done well previously to those books. So right now, it's very hard to get big numbers for a celebrity because of Arnold Schwarzenegger's book not doing well, Townsend's book not doing well, Stewart's book not doing well. And those are the numbers that publishers look at when they're making decisions about a certain level of talent.
But there's also two kinds of memoirs. There's writers' memoirs, and there's memoir that are going to be done, accomplished through collaboration. And I think that it's a much safer bet if you can work with the celebrity or the subject who can truly write their own memoir, because that's a book that we're going to still be looking at 15, 20 years from now.
But those are extraordinarily few and far between.
They are, but they're the ones to keep your eye out for. I mean, that's the...
Do you guys think the Amanda Knox book will sell?
I hope so. For HarperCollins' sake, I hope
For
so.
Harper's sake, I
Right.
hope.
Yeah.
I hope it sells.
But do you think it will?
There's probably a lot of interest.
You'd have
when
to
it
start to
comes
read it. I mean,
out.
that again,
gotta read
it's
it.
not.
I mean,
It's a
she
good
said
story.
nothing.
It's a great story, right?
She's
As
supposed
far
to
as
be
we
very
can
bright
tell.
and
Yeah.
I think their
kept
media
journals and
strategy-
diaries throughout her time in prison. I mean, she's certainly, by all accounts, approached it as a writer.
Was that somebody that any of you guys were interested in trying to sign Amanda Knox, or how about Casey Anthony? Is that somebody that anybody was?
You're shaking your head.
Yeah.
No, I don't do very much of this to begin with. I'm very, very sort of writerly driven. So most of the collaborations I work on are not celebrity works. It's someone who's had a harrowing experience. I'm working on a captivity memoir that's publishing this fall about a Canadian woman who was kidnapped in Somalia. And my whole goal for that book was to make it far more literary than salacious and sort of on the moment and a traditional captivity memoir. So I just don't really traffic in these kinds of books that much. But to go back to your question, will the Amanda Knox book sell? Absolutely, it's going to sell. I don't know, is there a collaborator on it? Do you know?
I don't know, actually.
I think there is. I'm pretty certain there is. And I think my partners, Michael Carlisle and Richard Pine, I think were both interested in representing that Amanda Knox project. So it wasn't, I think there were several people in town who were interested in it.
I think with any story that is a news story driven story, a lot depends on what the publisher is able to do to recreate that kind of excitement around the book when it comes out, second time around, really as a story. And secondly is it depends on what she's put in the book to help make it a national story again.
Although that could be a literary memoir when you think about it. There's no reason that the Amanda Knox story shouldn't be upmarket. It doesn't need to be tabloid. And in
But
fact,
there is an issue that comes up, and I'm curious if it's something that you guys debate internally over who you should be representing. Like, would you take a Casey Anthony, or are there lines that you are not interested in crossing?
yeah, there are lines I'm not interested in crossing.
And would that line be someone like her?
I would not have been interested in representing Casey Anthony.
No, Trident wouldn't be either. It's a terrible, tragic story for the child, and I just think that it's not something that we would want to take on.
I mean, the Casey Anthony thing, that's a different kind of, personal judgment. I think, so much of what any of us would take on really comes down to what are you personally interested in? And, it's a long process, developing the material, getting the book sold, getting it published, having it come out. I mean, the whole thing is like a 3-year commitment at minimum, and you really need to make sure that your interest is high enough to sustain it regardless
You
of what.
should be enjoying
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
I mean,
It should be-
you only have 24 hours in a day. You should be enjoying them.
Those should be calls that you want to take.
Right, exactly, yes.
What do you consider the best outlets for selling books? Best media outlets for promoting and selling books?
NPR is still excellent. Terry Gross is, I found out that Kate Atkinson on her forthcoming novels got Terry Gross, and I was done.
And there's
I
still
stopped worrying.
There's still just enough old media left to really move the needle. If you get the cover of the Times Book Review for a certain kind of book,
although sometimes not.
Sometimes not, but often it's the trigger that makes everything else fall.
It makes people pay attention.
And
Yeah.
there are 4 or 5 daily Times reviews every year that really move the needle as well.
Yeah.
And
Is the Times the one old media that really matters more than anything else?
Not the book review.
No, not the book review. No.
you feel the daily.
Well,
The daily
publishers.
review,
Yeah.
the daily review can
The daily review can
How about
really
TV?
kick something off.
Well, publishers
60 minutes.
have recently discovered Facebook and Twitter, but there's much more to it than that. I think the blogosphere is extremely important in terms of the promotion of books across the entire spectrum of book publishing. TV is a medium that has not been that active in terms of books. I think James Patterson still does television, but most authors
talking about advertising.
In terms of talk shows, it depends on the subject of the book and who the author is. Deepak Chopra does really well on the talk shows, but I think that the sound bite on CNN is not that meaningful. But I think the blogosphere is really the place you
yeah.
got to concentrate on.
Again, I do mostly YA, and it's definitely about the blogosphere, but it's also about the innate ability of the author to connect with their audience. That's not something you can teach. People, ask me all the time, what do I do online? How can I do what they do? And you can't recreate what John Green does. That is natural
So what
ability.
does he do?
That's his natural ability. Obviously his vlogs, his video blogs, where he connected with his brother and connected to this fan base on YouTube. That is natural talent, and you can't teach that to someone. And that's something that he created himself. And I think readers also relate to that, something that feels natural and doesn't feel that the publisher decided you should do this and
It's a
tried
question
to do.
that we get a lot from clients who, some of them say, do I have to tweet?
Right.
Do I
and
have
you
to be
know
on
then
Facebook?
that it's
And
not
if you
going
ask
to
that
work out
question, the
well.
answer is don't.
The answer is
Because
no, you
Right.
don't.
you
And
won't be
then-
any good at it. You won't have
Right.
any passion for it.
And then, those authors also who have that huge following, when they recommend other books too, that also can be a really big boost and much
But in
more
a certain
effective than
space,
others.
do you feel that it's necessary for an author to have a relationship with their fans?
I think again in YA, I think yes, it's
Ideally, yeah.
important. It's very important because they're online. I think it's harder, with middle grade and obviously with picture book, you have to be careful because you don't want to go after little kids. There are laws. But with YA, your fans, that's where they are, and that is how you reach them, and they feel they have a connection to you.
And they expect it.
They expect it, but also again when it's real, I think is when it's
It's
effective.
also part of their culture now.
Yeah.
My son works for me. I ask him to tell somebody something. I say, "Did you call him?" He says, "No, Dad, I texted him."
Yeah.
I said, "But I thought you should call him and have that personal contact with him." He said, "Well, I texted him. We'll get an answer."
I think in the adult space, authors having relationships with their readers and sort of having a one-to-one connection with those readers is incredibly important.
It's the most exciting thing about the way the business has evolved
Absolutely.
since we started,
Yeah.
right? Is the ability of these writers to interact directly with their fans.
Well, and they know who their readers are.
Yeah.
Publishers, by and large, do not know who actually buys their books. They know that Barnes & Noble buys copies from them to sell on, but we don't have any of the data. So where you have someone like Gretchen Rubin with the Happiness Project, we know who her fans are. We know who her readers are.
But Gretchen's a great example because she built that base over a couple of years before publication.
Yeah, it was a very. She had one of those
And she was good at
experiences
it,
where
and she
she
wanted to
had,
do it.
and her subject matter lent itself to it really easily. But she had a book that came out that sold very few copies, and we sat and had a drink, and she said, "I never want to do that again. So how do we make sure that never happens again?" And we knew what she was writing, and so we just started, figuring out what is the best way to tap into an audience and grow it. But even for whether it's for Jake Tapper or whoever it is, it matters that they know who their readers are because it helps inform the rest of the process.
And I have seen authors who didn't know that they would enjoy it until they began engaging.
Yeah, it
Until
does
they-
happen. The same thing with
Absolutely.
speaking tours.
Yeah.
Clients
Yeah.
who think, what do you mean I have to go out to 15 cities? I can't speak in my, PTA meeting. And then they get out there and they're like, this is better than staying home. I like this. It's
Much
always
better than
great to
PTA
watch
meeting.
that.
Do you feel that the social media aspect helped get a bigger and better movie deal for Fault in Our Stars?
Bigger and better media. I think, the thing with the social media, it's so intertwined with who John is and how he connects with his audience. He's also a brilliant writer. And that book is just his brilliant writing, and that obviously is very separate. But I think then the success of that book, it was, sort of the perfect storm of his social media skills, his brilliant writing skills, Penguin really coming into their own, with this sort of new group there in Penguin Kids, and just everything coming together at the right time. And so the book just soared, and then people loved that book, and so Hollywood loved that book, and we found people who were not afraid to make the book, because it's a very difficult book too. As funny as it is, it's also really heartbreaking subject matter, and we found people who were really fearless about it. So I think it wasn't in terms of the Hollywood deal that affected, it affected the success of the book.
I'm finding that authors who are already very successful bloggers are coming into the publishing business with a leg up. It's something that a publisher can launch off of more easily than trying to create a blogging atmosphere for an average author. I mean, someone like Deepak Chopra has 300,000 followers on Twitter. So he does a tweet and says, I have a book coming out, and 300,000 people know it instantly.
Know about it.
It's like the advertising campaign is already there.
Right.
Yeah.
By the time the book
Publishers
comes out.
and studios are looking for the same thing, in that when they decide to buy what to expect when you're expecting and attach a narrative to it, it's because they know that how many million, 125 million women in this country, know exactly what that movie's going to be about, and they know it's not going to be a primer. They know that something hopefully fun and fresh will have been done with it, and they're willing to give it a shot, which is easier than just starting from the ground, right?
Where do you guys find new talent?
Well, I should speak for my younger colleagues who are actually finding writers in places that I never would have thought to. I grew up scouring magazines and literary journals, and all of my clients were writing for those kinds of outlets. That has largely dried up as a feeding ground for new talent. Most magazines have their contract writers already under contract, and there's very little space there. So I'm finding, yes, that our younger colleagues are reading blogs, are watching Amazon bestseller lists for books that may be unrepresented but are starting to pop there. And it's incredibly encouraging to see the business transforming itself in front of our eyes, and learning how to create new special places where writers can actually develop their voice and be heard and make money while they're growing enough of a fan base to potentially jump over and join the commercial trade publishing side.
Well, the Amazon has created an opportunity for authors to be published who, under normal circumstances, would never be published, not because they can't write, but because of the bottleneck of traditional publishing, which requires heavy manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce a book to sell 50,000 copies. So that's a game changer in a big way.
And it's going to provide an outlet for mid-list authors who are getting frustrated with traditional publishing, may find there's either not a new deal to be done for them, or it will be the same deal that will sell the same number of copies. And I think a lot of authors are going to take these responsibilities back on board and sort of regrow their businesses, and then make a decision about where they'd like to publish their next books.
What's interesting in the push and pull between bloggers and online providers of free content is that people will still pay for it in book form. That is, they'll still pay in book form for that which they can have, in many cases, for free. So among the books that we've represented that came from online sources, there's Awkward Family Photos, there's Stuff White People Like, there's The Book of Awesome, and all these things came about because of the huge success that they found disintermediated contact between.
I give you a good example. We represent a book called The Abbey. It's written by a professor in Missouri. It's his first book. It's a story of a Midwest homicide detective who's a Muslim American. Now, if knowing the people I do business with in publishing, if I went out with that book to a traditional publisher, I would have a very hard time selling it. But the book sold 1 million copies on Amazon, 350,000 copies on Barnes & Noble, and suddenly publishers start to take notice and are able to move beyond what would have been
the kinds of stories they thought they could support.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, well, you're seeing the influence of self-published romance on now commercially published romance, which is to say that there's a lot more sex in it now.
Seen on all the covers.
Especially for the new adult genre. That's the new hot genre.
And I was going to ask, I mean, obviously that's 50 Shades. What else? What are the lessons?
Actually, that's not 50 Shades, new adult.
No, but the
influence, where the influence came
Yeah, I
from.
mean-
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that publishers wouldn't, most traditional houses would have not thought that 50 Shades was a book that they could do real business with to their romance, to their concept of their core romance audience.
Exactly.
You know, witness the fact that it was Vintage ultimately who
And Sonny Mehta of
triumphed
all
and-
people.
Yeah, or Anne.
and that's because of the graphic nature of it, specifically.
Yeah, and the quality of the writing, quite frankly.
I mean, historically,
they
it's a
would have
landmark
thought,
book.
Fiction, you know, I mean, that it had this sort of,
Yeah,
you know,
that it was
unusual
fan
origin,
fiction.
you know.
it had a lot of things going against it in terms of, from an agent's point of view, getting a deal from our colleagues in publishing.
Is there a lesson to be learned from that about what can cross over to become sort of commercial fiction?
Well, I always say that there's a famous saying in baseball by Yogi Berra. And he used to say that good hitting beats good pitching. And good pitching beats good hitting. And that's kind of like publishing in a way, because we never know where these things are going to come from. I think it's important as agents, and we've all proven that because we've all taken on new authors and people that we believed in and have sold on to publishing houses. But I think it's important for everybody in our industry to be open-minded today and not characterize an original ebook necessarily as a down-market book because it was published in that format first, but to look at it from a new perspective and an openness in the development of publishing programs and for agents to represent.
But we also have to be really, really clear about when we bring an actual value to an author's life. So I have no place chasing the next 50 Shades or whatever's going on online. The only business that I have any business committing myself to is when I find an author who has a voice and I can see how I'm going to contribute to that career. So I think there is an enormous amount of opportunity in chasing what's going on in self-publishing and chasing writing that's going on in blogs, what have you. But at the end of the day, as Christy said, you have to believe in it, and you have to have the sense that you can help improve the career and put it on a sustainable level. And I just think following trends is a really, really tricky way to build a list in our business.
Sure. But you were talking about how mid-list authors might be exploring new ways of publishing themselves as publishing houses pull back. Do agents have a role now in trying to build somebody's list up by suggesting, let's do an ebook only first, or let's do it on Amazon first, and if we can help you build a profile, and then we can move to a traditional publishing deal? Or
We're in an age of experimentation. I
Yeah.
think the publishers
Yeah.
are experimenting, we're experimenting, the authors are experimenting. There are, as you pointed out, many more outlets than there used to be. There's apparently a hunger, at least among a number of companies, for mid-length material, that is stuff longer than a short story or essay or article, but shorter than an actual book. There's Byliner, there's The Atavist, there's Kindle singles, and that, in a certain sense, takes the magazine out of the equation, and the traditional book publisher, and plugs something else in there. The results so far have been somewhat mixed but interesting. I think.
But yeah, to answer your question, yes, we have an absolute responsibility to be looking at a very specific client and their work and thinking about, you know, what's going to move the game forward. At this moment, what is it that you could be doing? Is it another book deal with a traditional house, or is it to create something shorter, or what is it that your fans and readers really want from you, and how do we help you deliver it?
Well,
But I think, and we can be more creative now because of the additional outlets. But I also think you're right that we have to make sure we can add to that process.
Well, this is when you confirm for yourself that you've made a good relationship with your client, is when the chips are down and the going gets tough. How are you going to sustain your efforts, and how are you going to push them through to the other side? To everyone's point here, 5 years ago, there were only a couple of outlets for book-length writing, and now there are all of these different mediums and all of these different outlets, and it's incredibly exciting. And as I said before, it literally is this very old-fashioned, very old-fashioned, very dysfunctional business sort of shape-shifting before our eyes and succeeding, which is incredibly exciting.
Also, the rate of change has accelerated so rapidly in a business that has had almost nothing change
Kind
in
of
it
perfect
for a
timing.
long
We would
time.
all be so
Yeah.
bored, isn't it? I mean, this is right at the point where, like, how long are you going to keep doing the same thing over and over again? Thank goodness it's all changing.
I mean, traditionally, it's 12 months between hardcover and paperback. It's always been that way as long as any of us have been doing this.
Except now when it's
Except
six.
now, or 3, or 5,
Or if
there's
it's
no
even
paperback.
longer, or there,
Right.
it takes longer because the hardcover is, sustaining itself so well, and then the e-novella comes up as a new interim.
And also
know,
the
and
schedule
it's-
moves up
Especially
faster
series.
because you
Yeah.
don't have publishers having to lay out long tours for authors, plans for authors, doing, getting out to the media outlets and trying to get them on board. Things have become a lot faster. But I will say that once you've made the decision about the author and your interest in representing the author, it is really about managing a basket of rights and all the different tributaries that lead into the great, revenue river, and how you're going to manage those rights in the environment that we're in today in the best way, to maximize the author's business. I think that's what makes an agent valuable at the end of the day.
Question for Christy and for Eric. What's the secret to media people crossing over into becoming successful authors? I mean, I
Are you
mentioned
looking
Bill.
for an agent? Is that?
Exactly.
We'll talk after. But the Bill O'Reilly example has got to be, I mean, that's such a phenomenal success.
A huge success. He had, at one point, the number 1 and number 2 hardcover nonfiction titles in the Times list, which I don't think anyone's ever done. I think a lot of it goes back to the Keith Richards book, in a certain sense, really wanting to do it and do it well.
Wait, you're comparing Bill O'Reilly?
I know, I'm wrapping my brain around that right
Comparing Bill
now.
O'Reilly to Keith Richards. I happen to love the Keith Richards
That's
books.
gonna be your
Those
quote.
books are really
Right.
good books. They, no, he's always been a passionate history fan. He has the biggest collection of presidential memorabilia anyone's ever seen. He has letters in the hand of every American president. He's wanted to do this for a long time, and he finally hurled himself into it. And I think it shows. I mean, he's crazy about history. He wanted to write history. Now he's reinvented himself as a popular historian. But that's after, I forget how many books, 8 or 9 books. The guy likes writing. The guy likes books.
But it's easy to understand why he wants to do it. Why is it so successful?
He has such a strong point of view, and I think there's a real advantage for people that go out, especially in the space that he's in, that have a very strong voice and point of view. There's nothing sort of down the middle.
And there's a passion there. There's a commitment to the story. He really wants to make history interesting to people. So he wants his viewers to read it, but he also wants people who consume popular history to read it, and he wants to blend those two audiences. He likes people who've never read a history book in their lives to buy those history books and to read them essentially as if they're thrillers.
So it is that having a voice and also having that kind of passion to back it up.
He's also on TV every day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was gonna say, as far as, I mean, with Jake Tapper's book, there were numerous books. I mean, we probably all, maybe except for you, Jodi, have like represented books, about Afghanistan, or sort of that took place, sort of in and around the war in Afghanistan. And so when Jake decided to do the Outpost, it was not necessarily going to be the easiest sale, even given, his presence. And he has like hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter and sort of cultivated over a long period of time. But because, he really devoted himself to the story, he got incredibly involved with the families, the soldiers that he was covering, and he had this very strong social media following. He was able to really drive the sales of that book. And Little Brown did an excellent job, both editing and publishing the book. But at the end of the day, I mean, he opted not to do a normal bookstore tour, and he only went to military bases because he basically wanted to sort of, be in the level of the families, and the sort of men that he was writing about. And it really worked because it was very personal for him. This was not him kind of cashing in on, his position in the media. It was, I mean, there were any number of subjects he could have written about, and he chose this one particularly. And it was incredibly effective. And he was just a very forceful advocate for that book. And that he had 250,000 Twitter followers, certainly did not hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Now, just to bring up the topic of sequels, you have Devil Wears Prada sequel coming out this summer.
I do.
As an aside, has Anna Wintour been involved at all with Lauren? Has she spoken to her?
Not that I'm aware of.
Has she attempted to influence the book or stop it or anything like that?
To her credit, not in the least. Absolutely not.
Interesting.
As far as we know.
For a sequel, is there like a timing kind of thing? Like how fast? This is going to be 7 or 8 years, I guess, between
It's actually longer than that. I didn't represent her for Prada. It was not a matter of timing. It was a matter of Lauren coming up with a great story that was organically what she wanted to write next, and she's done a completely brilliant job of taking that book, which has now become iconic both on the page and visually with the movie, and flashing forward 10 years so that it actually makes its own kind of internal sense. And we didn't even talk to her about writing a sequel. It was her idea to do so, and it was just because she came up with such a great plot.
Yeah, I think it differs, when you go into it knowing that it's going to lend itself to a sequel. I mean, that really did seem like the perfect sort of one-off book. And then if you come up with a perfect sequel idea, but it also gives you more time to plan the sequel. And often, when I think dealing with YA and romance and things like that, when they're series, usually it's more of a year at a time. Because the audience is expecting it and they don't want to wait, and even a year can be too long for a lot of these. Yeah.
This is actually something that we're dealing with right now because we have a book that's come out that is, I would call it upmarket erotica. It's almost like romance more so than erotica, but it's doing incredibly well here, is huge right now up in Canada and in Europe, and we're debating the timing of the sequel. And the audience, because they're used to in this space, like these books are published all at once. So you have 50 Shades gets republished, and it's like all 3 books are immediately available.
Right.
Sylvia Day, those backlists are republished, and the new books, and they're all available. So the same way that I would watch Mad Men over, you just watch them kind of marathon style. The audience, because she has a lot of interaction with the audience, they're like, 6 months.
Give me another.
Right, they don't want to wait.
Now.
And that's why the e-novella became so popular.
Yeah. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that something you would do now, which is try and release a short story or an e-novella in between, or are you telling authors, focus on the sequel, finish the book, don't get...
Well, they also need time to write it. That's the problem.
This is the thing.
That is the problem, right? Unless they write like all 3 in the beginning,
before,
and then you can
we
decide
thought about
how
it. You'd
you
write
want
all
to.
3 first,
I
and
don't know
then
that
publish
this
them.
is true for
tricky.
every writer, but generally shorter pieces take less time per page. So if you're saying to somebody, how long does it take you to write a 350-page novel? And they say a year. Well, writing a tenth of that is not going to necessarily take them a tenth of a year. The shorter the piece, the faster many writers can write it, which is why it's sometimes okay to lift your head up and write an e-novella, because you're gaining yourself quite a bit of time with a relatively smaller investment.
And with Sylvia Day, who's represented by Kim Whalen in our office, she, like a lot of these authors, now have these very close relationships with their audience. It's not like when I was a secretary at William Morris, where people would send letters and say how much they love the book. But now, on Facebook and Twitter and all other kinds of means, they're communicating with each other. So it's also putting a lot of pressure on authors to perform a lot faster. It's not just that the publisher wants it or the agent thinks it's a good idea, but the author's fans are very, very feel strongly about that next book coming out as quickly as possible, and it puts a lot of pressure on the author.
We have Mr. Patterson to thank for that, I think.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Is there a James Patterson effect on publishing? Has he changed how the authors sort of approach it? I mean, he's practically a one-man.
I think there used to be a sense that you really couldn't publish, an individual author couldn't publish more than 2 books a year.
Right.
And then it began to be pushed into, maybe 2 full-length books and a shorter Bridges of Madison County size book. And then James Patterson just smashed down the wall between how many books a single author can publish in a given year. I think one year he published 12 books.
That's correct.